QuitSmokingWeed.com, the podcast on Spotify.
You quit weed, and the anxiety that weed was supposedly treating is suddenly louder than ever.
It is an incredibly overwhelming feeling for most people.
It really is. Your chest feels tight for no apparent reason. You are on edge over nothing. And a very quiet, very persistent thought starts creeping in. It tells you that maybe this state of panic is just who you are without the drug.
That specific thought is exactly where most people get turned around.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a complete misread of a temporary brain state.
You start to wonder if the substance was the only thing holding you together. You look at how hard your heart is beating while you are literally just sitting on the couch, and you think you have fundamentally broken your brain.
Our mission today is to break down why this anxiety spikes so aggressively. We are going to map out the actual timeline of withdrawal and explain why returning to the substance right now is a dangerous trap. The panic you are feeling is a severe biological reaction to a missing chemical.
Right. It's not a sudden revelation of a broken personality.
Exactly. We are dealing with an under-resourced nervous system that is trying to rebuild its infrastructure in real time.
If someone is going to survive this initial window without relapsing, they really need to understand the physical reality of why their brain is currently in a full-blown alarm state.
People often think of quitting weed as just breaking a psychological habit. They think it is purely about willpower.
But we are actually dealing with hard neurobiology here, specifically within a network in the body called the endocannabinoid system, or the ECS.
Well, to understand the withdrawal, you have to understand what a healthy brain does to regulate itself. The ECS is essentially the master regulatory system of the human body.
It balances everything from your body temperature to your hunger, right?
Yes, and your immune response and your stress levels. In a normal, unmedicated state, your brain produces a molecule called anandamide. The name actually comes from the Sanskrit word for bliss.
Which is pretty fitting. It is basically our internal shock absorber.
It really is. When you experience a spike in stress, your brain releases anandamide to bring your baseline back down. It binds to specific receptors throughout your nervous system and tells your overactive neurons to cool off.
And then THC enters the picture and completely disrupts that delicate balance.
THC looks incredibly similar to anandamide at a molecular level, but it is much louder and much more potent. When someone introduces a heavy daily supply of THC, the brain notices this massive surplus of calming signals.
And the human brain is a highly efficient machine. It will not waste energy producing chemicals if it does not have to.
Exactly. So it responds by doing two distinct things. First, it drastically reduces its own natural production of anandamide. Second, it literally thins out the receptors designed to receive those signals.
That is the process called downregulation, right?
Yes. The brain essentially hands the heavy lifting of stress regulation entirely over to the external substance.
I look at this process like wearing a heavy, rigid brace on a joint for years. Like if you wear a thick knee brace every single day, the muscles around that joint are going to naturally weaken.
They atrophy because the brace is doing all the stabilizing work for them.
Right. Taking the brace off means the joint is going to feel incredibly unstable and painful the very next day. However, taking the brace off does not mean the joint is permanently broken. It just means the supporting muscles have weakened and need time to rebuild their strength.
The biological reality of early recovery tracks perfectly with that framing. When a person quits, the artificial muting effect of the THC disappears overnight.
But the brain does not instantly start producing anandamide again.
No, it does not. Those thinned-out receptors do not instantly regrow either. The core problem is that the natural calming system remains completely under-resourced.
The nervous system is basically running at 120% capacity with no functioning off switch.
Every minor stressor feels catastrophic because the internal shock absorbers are simply offline. People assume they are failing quitting, or they assume they are uniquely broken.
In reality, they are simply experiencing a severe physiological gap. It is just the gap between the removal of the drug and the slow reboot of the natural ECS.
So if the brain is practically running on empty, without its natural shock absorbers, it makes complete sense why someone waking up on day 10 feels completely terrified.
They feel that terror and immediately jump to the worst possible conclusion. They think this severe anxiety is their true, unmedicated self.
They think they're finally seeing their permanent baseline, and the severity of it convinces them they need the drug to function in society.
The logic feels incredibly convincing to the person experiencing it. You hurt, you feel terrified, and you assume this pain is your permanent reality.
This is exactly where people confuse a highly temporary biochemical state with a permanent character trait. It is a nearly universal experience.
I think the data shows something like more than 3/4 of people report significant anxiety during withdrawal.
Yes. This trap is especially common for people who use cannabis specifically to manage anxiety in the first place.
They think they're just reverting to their old anxious self from before they started smoking.
The harsh reality of this situation is that regular, heavy cannabis use actually raises baseline anxiety over the long term.
The drug alters the architecture of the brain to demand more of the drug just to reach equilibrium.
Cannabis was largely relieving the acute withdrawal anxiety that its own absence created between uses. The relief people felt when they smoked was simply the temporary satisfaction of an artificially created deficit.
It was a self-perpetuating cycle, not a functional medical treatment.
Right.
Okay, but look, I have to push back here. If someone had severe, documented anxiety before they ever picked up a joint, how are they supposed to separate their genuine pre-existing anxiety from this acute withdrawal anxiety?
It is a really difficult position to be in.
When you are standing in a grocery store line and your chest is vibrating with panic, it all feels completely identical. You cannot tell what is a chemical deficit and what is your own psychology.
Nobody can accurately assess their true baseline during the first month of abstinence. It is biologically impossible.
Withdrawal often unmasks pre-existing issues that were merely numbed by the substance and never actually solved.
Yes. But the critical factor is that the current spike is massively amplified by the brain's recovery process. The chemical deficit of anandamide makes any pre-existing anxiety exponentially worse than it would normally be.
The baseline you feel in week 2 is not your actual baseline. It is the baseline of a brain in active chemical withdrawal.
You simply cannot judge the ultimate structural integrity of a house while it is actively being renovated.
Because the current feelings cannot be trusted as a permanent baseline, we need a clear and realistic map of the timeline. People often read online forums and hear that the worst is over after the first 3 days.
They think if they can just make it through the initial weekend, they are completely clear.
That is a massive setup for failure. Preparing for a short sprint when you are actually running a marathon guarantees a crash.
Promoting the idea that the worst is over in 3 days is factually incorrect. It is deeply unhelpful.
The physical disruption of the first 3 days is difficult, but the psychological grind of the second week requires significantly more endurance.
Week 2 is frequently much harder psychologically than week 1. The initial physical shock of quitting morphs into a grinding mental exhaustion by day 10.
The novelty of making a life change wears off entirely, and the brain enters a profound state of fatigue.
That is usually when the dopamine deficit really sets in. Staring at a blank wall suddenly feels like the only thing you have the energy to do.
The clinical data completely supports that progression. For most daily users, the absolute peak of this anxiety occurs in weeks 1 and 2.
It is an incredibly vulnerable window. The expectation of a rapid fix is dangerous. We often see people looking for a specific calendar day when the anxiety will permanently vanish.
The nervous system does not operate on a rigid schedule like that.
No, it does not. The hard middle of this process is what we call the resilience phase. It takes sustained endurance. The chemical landscape only begins to stabilize for most people around weeks 3 and 4.
We should probably provide a clear medical caveat here for anyone listening who feels like they are entirely losing their grip on reality.
Absolutely. If symptoms become completely unmanageable, medical evaluation is strictly necessary.
And by unmanageable, we mean experiencing full panic attacks or a total inability to function at work or take care of basic hygiene.
Yes. No one should simply suffer through a total collapse of their mental health without professional support. There is no medal for enduring a nervous breakdown.
However, for the vast majority of people, this phase is extremely difficult, but entirely manageable. After 2 to 3 months, most individuals report feeling significantly calmer than they did while they were actively smoking.
We have established the biological cause and a realistic timeline. Now we need concrete actions to survive these peak anxiety weeks.
We need to focus heavily on physiology over mindset. Let us start with the most basic function, which is breathing.
Fighting the anxiety physically makes it worse. When you resist the panic, when you tense your shoulders and tell yourself that you should not be feeling this way, you signal to your primitive brain that there is indeed a deadly threat present.
That gives you 2 problems instead of 1.
Exactly. The breathing technique we recommend is purely mechanical. Breathe in through the nose for 4 seconds. Hold that breath in your lungs for 4 seconds. Exhale very slowly through the mouth for 6 to 8 seconds.
I am going to challenge this breathing advice because it usually infuriates people.
I know it does.
If my heart is beating 100 times a minute and I feel like the room is caving in, being told to just count my breaths feels like a slap in the face. It feels dismissive, like telling a drowning person to simply focus on swallowing less water.
That frustration is completely understandable. It sounds like an empty platitude found on a cheap motivational poster.
Yeah.
But we have to look at the actual physiological mechanism at play here.
This is not a mindset trick designed to calm your racing thoughts.
Right. The extended exhale directly stimulates the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is a massive nerve bundle that runs from your brainstem down through your chest and into your abdomen.
It is the primary component of the parasympathetic nervous system,
which controls the body's rest and digest functions. By forcing a long, controlled exhale, your diaphragm physically massages that nerve. You are applying a mechanical brake to your heart rate.
It functions exactly like pulling the emergency brake in a speeding car.
Yes. It reduces the acute intensity of the physical panic within 60 to 90 seconds. It will not cure the underlying emotional anxiety, but it takes the physical edge off enough to allow you to actually function in that moment.
We also need to leverage larger physical movements, specifically cardiovascular exercise. We are talking about 20 minutes of fast walking, running, or cycling.
This is not about getting in shape, building muscle, or punishing yourself for feeling bad. It is strictly about immediate neurochemistry.
The biological mechanism behind exercise during withdrawal is highly effective.
During this acute phase, the system is severely overloaded with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Physical movement literally burns off that excess adrenaline. It gets those stress hormones out of your bloodstream.
Simultaneously, intense exertion triggers a significant release of endorphins and dopamine.
By generating that release, you are naturally reactivating the exact reward systems that the drug was previously stimulating artificially.
It is one of the very few accessible ways to alter your brain chemistry in real time without any downstream costs.
Multiple people going through withdrawal report that daily cardio is the single most effective intervention they utilized. The effect also compounds over time. Consistent exercise over 2 to 3 weeks measurably lowers baseline anxiety levels.
Removing the drug also abruptly removes your daily anchors. The evening smoke session was a clear, undeniable signal to your brain that the workday was over and it was time to relax.
It created a firm boundary.
Without it, the day just bleeds endlessly into the night. And that lack of boundary heavily amplifies anxiety.
Predictability is exactly what a destabilized brain craves. The nervous system thrives on rigid routine when it is chemically unstable.
Establishing set sleep times, predictable meal times, and a daily walk signals safety and predictability to the nervous system.
Establishing those daily anchors reduces the background hum of anxiety that feeds the larger panic attacks.
I also want to talk about how the physical environment affects the nervous system, specifically when it comes to being around other people.
The instinct is usually to hide in a dark room until the feeling passes.
Isolating yourself completely is counterproductive. You do not need to attend crowded social events or pretend you are feeling great, but simply being near one person you deeply trust can significantly downregulate the nervous system.
We are biological organisms. Being entirely alone while in a state of high stress signals imminent danger to the primitive parts of the brain.
Physical proximity to a safe human being engages a process called co-regulation. Your nervous system literally syncs up with the calmer nervous system of the person next to you.
It signals safety on a subconscious level.
There are also specific chemical inputs we must manage while the system is rebuilding itself. Caffeine is a major culprit in amplifying withdrawal anxiety.
It really is.
I remember making this exact mistake myself and turning a mild morning tension into a full-blown panic attack before 10 in the morning. Drinking coffee during week 2 is practically tricking your body into a panic state.
Caffeine works through a very specific mechanism. It blocks the adenosine receptors in your brain, which prevents you from feeling exhausted, and it simultaneously steps on the adrenaline gas pedal.
If your nervous system is already redlining because it lacks its natural anandamide, adding caffeine is like cutting the brakes on a car that is already speeding down a steep hill.
Cutting caffeine significantly during this specific window is highly recommended to avoid pouring a stimulant onto a hypervigilant nervous system.
On the supportive side, there are specific supplements that actually move the needle. Magnesium glycinate taken in the evening is highly effective for reducing muscle tension and regulating sleep.
But we also need to dig into the supplements that sound like alternative medicine, but actually have hard clinical science behind them.
Lavender oil is a fascinating example.
Yes, I am referring specifically to standardized oral formulations like Selexin, which is often sold as Lycia. These have genuine clinical evidence for reducing generalized anxiety.
The mechanism of action is very specific.
The active compounds in the lavender oil travel through the bloodstream and interact directly with voltage-dependent calcium channels in the nervous system.
By modulating these channels, they calm overactive nerve cells, and they reduce the release of excitatory neurotransmitters.
In multiple trials, they perform comparably to low-dose benzodiazepines. Crucially, they achieve this calming effect with absolutely zero dependency risk and no withdrawal syndrome of their own.
And then there is CBD, which feels like it requires a massive disclaimer since it comes from the exact same plant people are trying to distance themselves from.
CBD has heavily documented anxiolytic properties, but its mechanism is entirely different from THC.
THC binds directly to the CB1 receptors in the brain, which is what causes the psychoactive high, and that is what forces the brain to thin out those receptors over time.
CBD does not bind directly to those receptors. Instead, it modulates the ECS indirectly. One of its primary functions is inhibiting an enzyme called SAAH.
This enzyme is normally responsible for breaking down your body's natural anandamide.
By inhibiting that enzyme, CBD allows whatever natural anandamide you do have left to stay in your system longer.
Because it interacts with the system without causing the psychoactive, anxiety-inducing effects of THC, many people find it genuinely useful for lowering the baseline tension during this specific withdrawal window.
The ultimate truth of this process is that the only way out of this cycle is forward. Retreating is simply not an option.
Returning to the substance resets the entire clock. It takes you right back to day one.
It guarantees that you will have to face this exact same physical and psychological gap all over again at some point in the future.
The anxiety you're feeling right now has a biological ceiling, it has a definitive timeline, and it has an end.
The intense discomfort of withdrawal is objectively awful to endure. But if we shift our perspective, we can see it differently.
This intense panic, this tightness in your chest that makes you question who you really are, might be the very first honest signal your nervous system has been able to send you in years.
It is a communication. It is an opportunity to finally address the root causes of your stress, rather than endlessly silencing the alarm with a chemical dampener.
The Release, Resilience, and Clarity program gives you the structure for exactly this. $20 a month at quit-smoking-weed.com.